Alright, so now it's part B of lesson 57. I've had a little snack, so I think it'll be better this time. Now, let's review again how we make our stitches in just this stitch direction. If you see this in a pattern, and again, this is for standard circular knitting needles. And we know, based on the picture online, and when we see this in the multiple of 10, well, they're repeating those 6 knit stitches, one on top of the other. And on circular knitting needles, when you're knitting in the round, that's going to produce the section of the scarf that is stockinette stitch. In other words, one side is going to be the V's, and if I would turn that inside out, you would see the bars. That's the wrong side for this pattern. And that's called stockinette stitch, when one side has all the V's and the other side has all the bars. Then you see this section, knit one, purl one, twice. But the second round reverses that. And that tells me, aha, even if I wasn't sure what it was based in the picture, I'd know that that was seed stitch for 4 stitches. So that's what the scarf is as you work around it, is a 6 stitch section wide of stockinette and one section that's only 4 stitches wide of seed stitch. Now, it's much easier to do front stitches with our little knitting hoop. And I also know if I do those knit stitches, as the pattern says, as front stitches, then the right side of the garment is going to be sticking out. You're going to see that. So when I write this pattern online for you, I'm going to be writing this as front 6, then front 1, back 1, front 6, back 1, front 1, just so you know how I arrived at that. Sometimes I tell you the opposite when I transpose these patterns. Sometimes, you know, I do back stitches when I see that front. And it just depends on what's the easiest to work. It doesn't really matter. The important thing to remember is when you see K's and P's, you're talking about V's and bars, and that will be really obvious as we work our pattern. So now we have to cast on. And so we're going to use the little knitting hoop we made in the part A. And I found that, let me bring this back because there was a reason I had this here. This is your, can you see that, Joe? Mm-hmm. This is your cast off edge right here. And I'll show you how we fix that little jog. And this is your cast on edge. Now, I found, and by the way, you're going to see a little bit of pulling in along this edge, particularly on this row where that seed stitch is. I tried to do this by just knitting one row before the pattern started, and I didn't like it. But if it's completely wool, if you're using a wool yarn, you can block that. But truthfully, when you have this on, that will never be noticeable that there's a little jog there. And it's because you changed stitch pattern. So we're going to do a slingshot cast on. It'll give you a little more substantial edge here, but it doesn't eliminate that entirely. You could try just knitting one row first, but I found it didn't really help with it's just a matter of the pattern. If you block this, that would go away. But, you know, it's hard to block acrylic yarn, just to be aware of that. Alright, so let's do our cast on, and we'll do a few of these just to refresh your mind about what a slingshot cast on is. And everybody does their, you know, slip knot a little bit differently, but I like to be able to pull on my tail and tighten up that stitch, so I make my slip knot like that. So now your working yarn, well, let's put this on first. So you want to cast on to the big side, because that's going to determine the size of the stitch. So now put your loop of your slip knot on there, and don't make it too tight. If you can't move these stitches, you've got them way too tight. And now the working yarn is on the right here, around my finger, and the tail is around my thumb, and it'll look just like this. Sometimes this is called the double thumb cast on, but go under that piece, then under the one that's over the index finger, and then pull. Now, if I pull the tail, I'm making that little V neater, and if I pull this side, the working yarn, I'm going to make it tighter around the tube. You don't want that too tight. Those have to move. So there's 2, and again, you're just doing what's normally called a slingshot cast on. You go under the thumb strand, under the index finger strand, bring the thumb strand back over, and then pull. This is standard in any knitting technique. I'll make one more, and then we'll switch to the other tube. So it's just a typical thumb cast on. And again, if those can't move, you're way too tight, and you should start over. So that's how you do a slingshot cast on. Now I put 20 stitches on here so that we can start our pattern. And don't forget your stitch counter, or row counter. So this will be our first row. And here's our 20 stitches. To begin knitting, you're going to have to turn it around so that the tail and the working yarn are on the right. And just leave the tail off to the back and rotate these so they're pointing away from you, if you will, like so. And you need a little marker to mark the beginning of your row. It could be just a little piece of yarn. You've tied in a knot there. And now you can begin your first row. And the first thing you need to do is front stitch 6. And in this case, again, the pattern said knit 6, but it's much easier to front stitch. So now I have my working yarn. Make sure you have plenty of slack. I like a little slack pile in my lap. And take your first stitch off and lay it over your working yarn. You can either push the working yarn up through, like so. It'll look just like this. And then pipe it, just like that. Now this first one you can pull up a little firmer because it's the beginning of the row, remember. And you want to, it's where you're joining, you're making your join. The other way you can make a front stitch is to lay that stitch over those and then take your finger and just hook it. And when you pipe it, that working yarn should still be towards you, and put it on the other side. And again, don't pull too tightly. They have to move on there. Now, we're going to do that 6 times. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6, and now we front one again. So we do this again. Now this first row is going to be a little tighter. It won't be like this. This is your cast on. You're knitting your cast on stitches. Oh, that was a front one. Now we need to back one. So this time we take the stitch off and we put it on our finger. We lay the working yarn over the top, and then I like to just rotate my hand and bring the yarn through so that it looks like this. Now we have to do that twice, and then we front one again, just gets piped like so, and now we back one. I like take it off, put it on my finger, rotate my hand, and that's your stitch, and it gets piped just like that. Now let's look at those first 6 stitches. Okay, so it looks a little different than when you do this with knitting needles on a circular. It's like the opposite. So you're going to see a little bump there where those knit stitches are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7 because that's our pattern. Knit 1, back 1, knit 1, back 1. And now we knit 6 again. So 6 front stitches. So again, lay it over the working yarn. Use your finger to bring the working yarn through. Pipe it. Here's 2. Here's 3. Here's 4. Here's 5. Here's 6. Alright, we should have 4 stitches left, and we do. So now we do our seed stitch section, so front, and now we have to do a back. You do not have to do your back stitch the way I did. If if you have trouble turning your wrists, and I know some of you do, we'll do one more front here. When you do your back stitch, if you have any trouble, oops, what's going on here? Get out of there, you little devil. When you go to do your back stitch, if you have trouble turning your wrist, you can take your yarn first to the back and then press your yarn against that loop and then bring your yarn through, and there is your back stitch. And now we've completed one row. Now the first couple rows you have to keep careful track because it's hard to see the pattern. So now I know I knit 6 or front stitch 6 in this. For this pattern, I'm going to front stitch for my K's, if that makes any sense. Knit, front stitch, and how many have I done here so far? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I need to do one more, another front stitch. Now, for this second round, or my even number rounds, the next stitch, instead of front stitching it, I'm going to back stitch it. Now you can see that I did a front stitch. You see my little V? It's upside down, but that's what it is. Now this time I want to back stitch that. So I lay my yarn over, and I turn my hand, and I hook it, and I pipe it. Then, let me take this stitch off. You can see that I back stitched this. There's my bar. So this time I want to front stitch that. Now, let me take this off, and I can see that's a V. I need to back stitch this. And now, this last one, again, there's my bar from my last stitch. I need to front stitch. So that is your 4-stitch seed stitch section. And now I repeat my front 6, which is how I'll write it in the body of my, my description box. I'll write front 6. But like I said, for this pattern, it is easier to do these front stitches. So that's where I say, for the K's, I told you to front stitch. You must think I'm crazy by now. Sometimes she tells us to front stitch, and sometimes she tells us to back stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm back to my seed stitch section. So I'm on an even number round. I did a V there. You see, there's no bar. I did a front stitch. I have to make a bar. And that's another way of thinking about this. Bars and V's. Even if you don't really grasp knits and purls and fronts and backs, it doesn't matter. You want to make V's and bars. See that bar there? You remember, to make that bar, I have to bring the yarn through the front or the back of the stitch, however you want to look at it. In this case, it's kind of the top of the stitch. If I wanted to make that bar, I would come through the top, but look, now I have 2 bars in a row. That's not going to fit my pattern, but I want to just show you the example. I need a V this time, because I know that's how I make seed stitch. So even if you don't know what to call it, you know you need a V there. I need to come in underneath the stitch, or at the front of the stitch, and drop the old stitch to this side, because that's what creates the pattern. Where you bring the yarn through and where the old stitch drops is the essence of knits and purls. This is a V. I need a bar. Well, there's only one way to make it. I lay the yarn on top, and the old stitch gets dropped to the front of the knitting, the right side of the knitting, we're going to call it. And then there's my bar. I need a V. And there's only one way to make it. I got to bring my yarn in from the front. If it was sitting like this, I would call it the front. But it's, in this case, I'm working on the hoop. It's underneath the stitch. I need a V. And every row now, every time I make an odd row, I'm back to what I do in round 1. Now, let me show you after a bit. There's your 20. Now, this has, I'm about to begin row 9. Now, even if I didn't know that, if I've lost track, look, and didn't even have one of these, After the first 2 rows, it doesn't matter because look how obvious your pattern is. Now, I have taken to putting my feet up on a little stool here and put my, make a little hammock for yourself with your shelf liner so you can set your knitting right there. So I'm about to begin another round, and I hope you can see this pattern. This is, again, this is a Woolies, and let me point something out since we happen to be here. See this knot at the very beginning? That's where I made my slip knot. So, and I don't like seeing that. That's why I often make that little twisty thing, just FYI. So now you move your stitch marker over, and now, I mean, gosh, 9 rows into this, look how obvious the pattern is. You can't goof it up. So if I take a stitch off, it comes off like so, it comes down over my working yarns. I know I need to make a V, you see, and that's exactly what I do. And I'm going to make V's. And now, if you are working on this tubing, this is the one that's the US 19. It's 16 inches around. You can see how full it is. Be very careful as you're working your stitches around, you don't knock them off. But it's also a little harder to push your stitches up. So when I need to move my stitches, I start at this end and kind of do a little bit of this. If you have trouble with your wrist, just keep it laying down on your lap so you don't, if you know what I mean, because you need to make room on this side for your stitches. And you work your way around, and these are all, again, V's. You can see, that's why I want you to do this as front stitches for your stockinette too, because normally, if we're on the stationary rods, this is kind of facing away from us. We're often looking at the wrong side, but not this time. We're going to be looking at the right side as it lays in front of us. Now, see, I'm still in my stockinette. This is the last stitch. Even if I've lost track, I know where I'm at. Now let's take this stitch off. Well, I made a bar here on my last stitch. So this time I know I need to make a V to stay in my seed stitch pattern. And I come underneath, or front, however you want to think of it. Now in this row, looking back, here's my bar way back here. Here I have a V, and I need to make a bar. How do I make that? By making a back stitch, or laying the yarn on top of that stitch, bringing the new stitch through, and that drops that old stitch to the front of my knitting on the face, and now I have a bar. This, I need a V. Here, pull this over a bit, you can see that better. Here I need a bar. And that is how, and again, these will start to stack up, so you need to work your way around. If you can't push these on, you can try a couple of things. Take a moist towel, like a wash rag, doesn't even have to be soapy, and clean your tubing off. Oh, we're going to have to go to a part C because I'm out of battery time.